Joining me on the Capitol Report set, we have Governor Mark Dayton. Thank you so much for joining us, Governor.
Glad to be here, Julie.
And let's begin with a look at the promise that you made Minnesotans when they elected an all-DFL legislature, and you had promised progress. So, in your opinion, where do you think the most progress has been?
Well, I think we delivered on what the candidates last November said they wanted to do, and what I said 2 years before I wanted to do, which is to raise revenues progressively. And the tax increases on the top 2% of income earners, average income over $500,000 a year, taxable income, and closing tax loopholes that allow the largest corporations to avoid paying their fair share of taxes, and turn around and offer that in property tax relief and other forms of assistance to middle-income families. Education, we put money into all-day kindergarten. First time, and that'll be historic. Early childhood education, we multiplied tenfold the funding for those scholarships. And right up through higher education, we increased student aid, put a freeze on tuitions, which will help access to college for middle-income kids and their families. And we put it into job creation. I was down in Rochester yesterday, Mayo Clinic. I mean, that's an incredible expansion that bring thousands of good-paying, good jobs to that area of the state and benefit the entire state and keep Mayo expanding and being the premier medical institution in the world right here in Minnesota. It's just an incredible opportunity, and frankly one that I don't think Republicans would have supported if it had been on their watch. So, you know, in all these areas of job creation and education and progressive revenues, we said we did what we said we'd do.
And let's talk a little bit more about education. Senate Minority Leader David Hand contends, he said right on the Senate floor, that despite funding increases over the past decades, Minnesota schools keep falling short. The achievement gap is widening, and to him, more money does not equal reform. In your opinion, does this education package have enough accountability measures in it? Does it have things to help truly close that achievement gap, or is it just more money?
Well, in my experience, starting as a public school teacher for a couple of years, you know, more money is not a guarantee of success in education, but less money is almost a guarantee of failure. And relative to inflation, the increased number of students, and the increased needs of students in our schools, Minnesota's K-12 education funding has not kept pace with those needs or with inflation, or we ranked 5th among the states in 1996 in student spending, K-12, and now we're down to 33rd, according to the Minnesota Taxpayers Association. So relative to what other states are doing, in terms of reform, all-day kindergarten, I mean, that's a huge reform. It's going to make a huge difference for so many kids. And for parents right now are paying, in some cases, $4,000 for all-day kindergarten, $2,400 for part-time kindergarten. The early childhood education, you know, was a concept developed really the last session, and there were some great Republican innovators, Jen Olson and others, who were behind that. Dwayne Benson, who was former Senate Republican leader in the business community, and they ran, you know, the Republican leaders ran head-on into their two extreme right-wing caucuses, who thought we were going to, you know, I don't know, do whatever they thought we were going to do to these children. So we had to surreptitiously get $4 million into that program, and this year it's up to $40 million. And if we can show the benefit of that, especially for kids from disadvantaged backgrounds, in terms of closing the diversity gap, then we'll be able to go further. So, I mean, my problem, Republicans are just so anti-public education, and everything that's wrong becomes another, you know, sledgehammer for them to use. So achievement gap, yeah, we're all unhappy with that situation, but you know, what do they propose to do about it? You know, homeschooling, charter schools, I mean, you know, they have their place, but 95+% of the kids in Minnesota are going to go to public schools, so how are we going to make them better? And what are their ideas to do so? And how many times have any of them been in a public school in the inner city of Minneapolis, St. Paul, or Duluth in the last decade to even understand what the reality is in those schools? I've been in a couple hundred of them, and I taught in one for 2 years, and I know, you know, the challenges that these teachers face every day, and all they get from, you know, the Republicans especially, is just blame, blame, blame.
So does your instinct tell you that these provisions are going to work?
I think they're the best we know how to do. I think, given the breakdown of the nuclear family and so many family units in this country, we're behind the 8 ball before we even start. I mean, you see what happens in the first, 2, 3, 4 years of a young child's life, and you realize how disastrous that effect is on their development. And then we come in and say, now we're going to try to remediate all that. But again, the experts and people like Don Fraser and others have said for 40 years that we need to start earlier, and I think we're slow to recognize that. So now we do, and hopefully we'll get better at it.
Well, from there, let's move on to taxes. Revenue Commissioner Myron Franz advocates for expanding the sales tax. Senate Majority Leader Tom Bach also expanding the sales tax. You at one point had considered it as well. So is it something that you might consider in the next session, particularly given that it's not a budget year?
Well, I think anybody who says they want to reform the sales tax or any taxes in Minnesota should definitely come into this office and try it out and bring their hard hat with them. The last 25 years have been tax reform commissions from Governor Purvich to Governor Plenty, and they've all recommended broadening the base. And Governor Purvich tried it back in the 80s, and he got hammered, and Governor Ventura tried it when he was in office. He got hammered, and I tried it, and I got hammered. And we could have done a better job of trying to explain it all, but basically the opponents of it just found one thing, that they, denial of access to justice. So the lawyers all, ran that one up and down. So
probably not.
Well, it's just very, very difficult, and again, they'll pick on the things that are going to go up, even though in total it's going to go down for people. But no one gets to understand that by the time cement is dried and set.
Understand. And speaking of cement and hammering, it looked like the Capitol renovations might stall until next year, but you were able to pull that out in the bonding bill. What size bonding bill would you now advocate for next session? Do you want it to be a really big one to compensate for the fact that this year was relatively small?
Well, I'm very disappointed this year. I mean, the Capitol, we got enough to credit of the 4 caucuses to keep that project going on track. We'll need another amount next year to complete the work, but I'm confident that one's going to go through. I mean, the rest of it was just lost opportunities. I mean, thousands of jobs that could have been created all over Minnesota for downtown projects in Mankato and St. Cloud and Boston and other places around the state, and improving the higher ed buildings and roads and bridges. I mean, the problem is the Republicans just don't believe that there's a positive role for government in economic development and creating jobs in partnership with the private sector. And you look at what happened in Mayo yesterday, where if the state and the local and county governments had not stepped in to become partners, Mayo made it clear they were going to look somewhere else. You look at the stadium, the day after they announced the design, Ryan Construction announces a $400 million office project right adjacent to it. And the artist's rendition of what that area looked like with the green area and then the buildings, I mean, total transformation of that part of Minneapolis, and thousands of people will be put to work carrying that transformation out.
So can you get the Republicans on board for next year?
I've tried for 2.5 years. They just ideologically don't believe that there's a constructive role for government in partnering with businesses and create economic growth and jobs. The businesses understand that. Mayo made that clear. Others have been in that situation. 3M is expanding research and development based on the state assistance. So the people who live in the real world and work there are well aware of the benefits and the necessity. But I've not been able for 2.5 years to persuade Republican ideologues of that.
And let's talk about that a little bit more. The GOP message of this session was overtaxing, overspending, overreaching. You tend to be pretty blunt. What do you think of those words?
Well, I think it's to be expected. But again, last November, the people of Minnesota had a choice between no tax increase, which meant protecting the wealthiest Minnesotans and the largest corporations from paying their fair share of taxes, and cut another $627 million to balance the budget for the next biennium. That's on top of the over $2 billion of cuts we made in 2011, the Republican legislative leaders and I, that are permanent cuts that carry forward. Or we're going to raise revenues progressively, and we're going to, continue to look for areas to cut spending, and we're going to increase our investments in education and job growth and the like. And people in Minnesota spoke. They replaced Republican majorities with Democratic majorities, and we delivered on that. Now, I respect that the Republicans have a different point of view, but we cut higher education 14% for this biennium compared to the one before. That's a permanent cut. Absent any action by the legislature, that would just continue, another 14% for the next 2 years. So we increased higher ed funding by actually $240 million. That just offsets the $240 million cut the previous biennium. So that shows up as a spending increase, $240 million, but it's just taking us back to even to where we were 4 years before. And you could go through the entire budget and point that out. I mean, it is what it is, but it's not what how it's presented to be.
So, Governor, let's move on to policy issues. We had the unionization, the vote for daycare providers to decide whether or not they wanted to be in a union. And we also have the same-sex marriage law. How important was it for you to have these pass last session? Could they have waited until next session, which is typically considered a policy session? And then let's talk about some of the policies we can expect next session.
Well, I have an objective for the next session, which is, I call it the unsession, which is to spend most of the time undoing overlapping, duplicative, obsolete laws, regulations, the like, verbiage in the statutes. And I think it's going to be a fascinating session if people get into it. And I've already heard from a number of legislators who are excited about the idea.
Can you get the Republicans on board with that one? That seems like it would.
I would think so. Yeah, I hope so. I've been focused on this session. I haven't spent much time talking to anybody about the next one, but
Fair enough.
I think it's got great potential. So anyway, I mean, I always thought the odd year session was both budget and policy as well. So I think this was the time to deal with them. And you got enough time to go through the committee process and all. And
were you pleased that they
well, I was. I support same-sex marriage. I believe that marriage equality is a constitutional right of this country, and I'm glad they defined civil marriage as distinct from religious and said no church or religious group has to marry anybody that they don't approve of. And on the other hand, civil marriage is governed by the U.S. Constitution and Minnesota Constitution, and my reading of the Constitution, the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause, guarantees every American citizen with equal protection, guarantees, and rights under the law. And that certainly, to me, ought to include the right to marry the person you love. So I make that distinction. I think the legislature did properly, and it's obviously an issue that divides closely the Minnesota population, but I think we're moving in the direction that is properly constitutional and right.
And the daycare union issue, that was very contentious. Would you consider it a year for organized labor?
Well, it was very important to them, but the principle here, it's not about creating a union or not. It's about giving the people who are affected by it, the service providers, the right to vote, to decide whether they want to be in a union or not. Right now, the legislature, up till now, has been saying, you don't even get to vote. We've decided we don't want you to be in a union, so we'd decide. Well, that's just undemocratic, small d. And this says you get a vote. The daycare providers, workers will vote whether they want to join a union or not. The personal care attendants vote whether they want to join a union or not. I mean, to me, that's just as American as it gets in my mind.
Governor, we only have 2 minutes left. I want to ask you real quickly. Next year, we can expect to see minimum wage, anti-bullying bill, possibly medical marijuana, and transportation issues are coming to light as well, maybe moving away from a gas tax. What do you consider the marquee piece of legislation that you would like to see next session?
Well, the unsession. I want
become
to see.
session.
I want to see this cleanup. You read these statutes. I mean, you can take 90% of the words out and make it comprehensible and just as effective, if not more so. It takes 18 months to do a administrative rule, 18 months to an environmental impact statement. And we got this stuff so overlaid and different jurisdictions on top of everybody else. It takes up people's time. It slows progress, and we're going to change it.
30 seconds or less. If your tenure were to end today, what would you like your legacy to be?
That I straightened out the fiscal mess that I inherited, that we restored tax fairness to Minnesota, and we made that investment in education, jobs of the future.
With those words, Governor Mark Dayton, thank you for showing up on the Capitol Report set. We appreciate it.
Glad to. Thanks, Julie.